Hello, everybody. I'm Professor Adrian Vickers from the University of Sydney, from the School of Languages and Cultures. So today I'd like to talk to you about what we do in what we call area studies. So today I'm speaking up first, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Fernanda Penaloza and Professor Peter Morgan, and we'll be going through three aspects of some of the things that we do in the ways that we approach teaching languages and cultures. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the tradition of the custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand, and that's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm also joining you from Gadigal land, and I and all my colleagues pay our respects to those who have cared for and continue to care for country. Okay, so let me start by this big question of what is area studies. So what do we mean when we talk about area studies and the idea of general studies at the University of Sydney? And in my case, I'm talking about my perspective as somebody who teaches and runs the Asian Studies program, and in my case, looking at what is really the population of half the world. And in this image you see here, you can see where there are great concentrations of population in Asia. So one of the things that we do in our teaching and our research, if we're looking at Asia in terms of area studies, is actually approach the field through a variety of different means. And we talk about these as disciplines. So you might be more familiar with the idea of society and culture. That's one way, or one of the contributing ways of looking at area studies. Area studies really takes in history, geography, anthropology, the study of societies and cultures, but also language and literature and art. I actually also work on art history myself, and can also involve social sciences, political science, economics. And what we do is combine different perspectives to understand different parts of the world. Because in the School of Languages and Cultures, we're really focused on the idea that it's not just language that we look at, but if you want to understand people, you need to understand in a holistic way the different location-centered or area-centered ways of perceiving the world and ways in which people look at themselves and act. So culture is one important part of that. And the long-term history in Asian studies, we go back almost 5,000 years to look at different ways in which Asia has come together as a place, but also to understand the different cultural forms, whether they're modern culture or traditional culture. So this is a little bit of an insight into the idea of area studies as a way of looking at different parts of the world. So I'll now hand over to my colleagues to talk more specifically about their own parts of area studies. And then at the end, I'll return to say a little bit more about Asian studies.
Thank you, Adrian, for that. I'm going to share my screen. Very excited to be here talking about my area, which is Latin American studies. And very similarly to what Adrian was saying, we have to think about, the fact that area studies focus on a particular part of the world. So the part of the world that we focus on in Latin American studies is Latin America. And I don't know how many of you know what Latin America is, but it's a region, and we have two continents, North America, including Central America and the Caribbean, and South America. And as you can imagine, you probably have already a sense of how huge this area is. And perhaps you already know a few things about Latin America, like, the food that came to Western countries because of the period of colonization, the fact that we speak European languages, but also a lot of indigenous languages that are spoken, as well as other European languages. And one of the things that we want students to become aware, and I think that's so important for the current challenges that we are facing in the world, is that there are other sides of knowledge production that, that are not the sides of knowledge production that we associate with the English-speaking world. And that is the case of Latin America and the many technological innovations, but also the ancient wisdom of indigenous peoples, which has not disappeared because of colonization. It has evolved and changed and adapted, and also be combined with other paradigms of knowledge or traditions outside the region. So I really like to emphasize that, in common with other area studies that we explore in the School of Languages and Cultures, Latin America is also a region that opens up a way of thinking and our ways of being, because we're exposed to different trajectories of knowledge production. So when you take, units within Latin American studies, which we offer as part of Spanish and Latin American studies programs, that we also contribute to other units that are taught in teams across the School of Languages and Cultures and in other schools, we give you what we consider is quite, I think, important in understanding area studies, which is the principle that in order for you to really comprehend the different cultures, you have to understand the history, you have to understand the societies in which those cultures are circulate, and also politics and languages. So we have like this complex situational and contextual understanding of all these different elements, and they do really enrich the way in which we experience the world around us. And just to give you a sense of what I mean, perhaps it's better to look at what our students say, which they really highlight that this cultural focus approach, which comes with this tradition of area studies, is what helps them to have a more valuable experience and really have a more in-depth understanding of the role of languages and cultures in different parts of the world. And more of that feedback, I think it's so important that one of the very valuable transferable skills that you will find when you study any field of area studies is that you can clearly see that there are many ways in which you can approach a situation, many ways in which you can offer solutions to problems, and many ways in which you can interpret one single event or one historical period. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. And I would like now to give the opportunity for my colleague, Professor Peter Morgan, to talk about European studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you, Adrian, for that introduction. I'll just share my screen and be right with you. Hello, I'm Professor Peter Morgan of the European Studies Program. Europe, you probably all have a bit of an idea of what it is. Well, let me summarise it as a very complex group of nations, cultures, societies and languages with a history going back well over 2,000 years. The European Union, by contrast, is a supranational governance organisation set up in Europe after 2 world wars almost destroyed that whole
Because
continent.
our youth put meaning into empathy and solidarity. They believe we have a responsibility towards the planet.
In European studies, we look at the relationships between Europe in that broader sense and the EU, and we look at the functioning of the EU in the contemporary environment.
Now, after 16 years, the era of Angela Merkel is coming to an end. 16 years in which the German Chancellor faced unprecedented challenges at home, in Europe and abroad.
Most of the material that we look at in this course over the whole year is contemporary. What has been happening in Europe over the last 5 to 10 years at the most. You don't need a language other than English in order to study European studies. If you have a language, that's fantastic, but you certainly don't need one. It's all done in English. And we try to penetrate the everyday lives of Europeans in different parts of Europe using films, contemporary European films and documentaries to understand how major political issues actually affect people at the grassroots.
Ты в Бога веришь?
Где твой Бог милосердный?
На земле нет подобного ему.
We look at the main issues affecting contemporary Europe. The rise of the far right, the changes in the political constitution of Europe, the effects of the refugee crisis in 2015, the effects of the global financial crisis, the changes in relationships amongst the nations that make up the European Union and Europe more broadly. All of the member states of Europe have a higher quality of life and increased prosperity and greater stability since they joined the EU, so it has been an unmitigated success story. There have been some ups and downs for sure, and we look at them in this course, but overall the EU has been extremely successful. The EU is worth studying because it is the promise of a global future in a world that otherwise is not actually looking so rosy. I hope to see you in European Studies 1001 and 1002 next year, and look forward to talking about these issues in much greater detail then. Thanks, goodbye.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to pick up on a few of those points and to just explain a little bit about what we teach in Asian studies. Yes, obviously, if Asia is half the population of the world with hundreds of major languages, then none of us are going to be able to speak all of those languages, although I do have some very multilingual colleagues. So we teach in English, and we hope that some of you who are studying languages might be interested in pursuing the wider cultural and social studies that we offer in Asian studies. But we also look at material in translation. And one of the things that we do is look at connections across Asia. So if you think about Asia as a very rich and diverse area, then we also want to understand what are the aspects that join Asia together, how South Asian, i.e. Indian, and East Asian, for example, Chinese cultures might have elements in common and might share different experiences, share common ways of looking at the world, and come together over a number of different aspects of culture, as we see in this example from Singapore, where, and I should say, of course, that people usually associate rice eating with Asia, but of course, this is part of the diversity of Asia, the many kinds of amazing ways to approach food and to think about the social settings that go into making up even something like food consumption, i.e. how you go, how things come together in urban settings. Here we are, Hong Kong, a good example of an important urban location in Asia that we look at, but also how things like foods like rice might come from rural settings, such as we see here some rice paddies from Bali. So we're interested in these social aspects of everyday life, but we're also interested in the aspects of big picture culture, everyday culture, traditional culture. Here's an illustration of the Chinese literary masterpiece, The Journey from the West. The Journey to the West, which many of you might know as the story of Monkey. This is one of the examples of the kinds of things that we study. Why literature like this, written in the 16th century about the Buddhist religion, still important, why such literature is still important in the present day, and what are the deep cultural roots that help us to understand stories like Monkey, but also, I guess, the streams of religion, of different ways of seeing the world. And here we see some of the ancient cultures illustrated in the example of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. But of course, we're also interested in modern cultures and links between ancient and modern cultures, an industry like K-pop, which we can look at both in terms of its cultural manifestations, but also as a way of mass producing different kinds of popular culture for broad global audiences. And this is, I think, another aspect of what we look at, the idea of Asia not just connecting together as a single continent, but also the role of Asia in the world and the changing position of Asia. Whereas, say, 50 years ago, we might have taught Asian studies as about conflict or crisis. Nowadays, we teach about Asia as the economic centre of the world, as the great powerhouse for understanding not just everyday consumer goods, but economic, social, and political changes. Asia, for example, includes two of the largest democracies in the world, India and Indonesia, but it also includes a number of autocratic countries, and we look at the relationships between politics and culture. So they're examples of the kinds of things that we do in area studies. And just to make it concrete for you, one of the things you might ask about, so if you do area studies, if you focus on Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, as you can in our school, what kinds of careers might that present to you? So here's some examples. We've got one of our alumni that I'm in touch with is, for example, a second secretary in the Australian Embassy in Vietnam, and we have a number of former students who work in DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've got another who's a journalist based in Hong Kong. So she did Asian studies and Chinese language, and she's had the very exciting job of covering major changes that are going on in Hong Kong at the moment. One of our other alumni, for example, works as a consultant on diversity and inclusion. And after she worked for many years in different parts of Asia, including in aid programs in Timor-Leste and in various other government-related programs, she's now advising to different companies about the nature of diversity and inclusion and how those companies might organise themselves to better reflect the society that we live in Australia. And that relates to the fact that we've had other alumni who are aid workers. We've got one who's a translator, and she translates to various prime ministers and other heads of state. We've got others who are working in other government departments, including in defence and intelligence. I can't tell you too much about what they do. I'm not allowed to. But there's a host of really interesting careers that people can go into with an area studies background. So, okay, I might leave it at that and invite any questions if anyone has anything to ask of us.
So much, Adrian, Fernanda, and Peter. I just wanted to reiterate what I popped in the chat. We've popped a lot of course page links for your reference and details on some comprehensive details on electives and you know, course specific degree information. But if you do have any questions, there isn't currently anything in the Q&A at the moment, but we do have a few moments to spare. So our academics are welcome to answer any questions you may have. So if you do, we can wait a few moments and, you know, see if there's anything coming through. If you do have something, you can pop it in the Q&A and we'll address it fairly shortly for you. And if there aren't any questions, you are welcome to leave the webinar. The presentations are complete for the day, but it's up to you. We can definitely hang around a couple more moments and answer any questions you may have around the degree, course requirements, anything at all.
Perhaps, Larissa, if I just, or one of us just clarifies the language issue.
Mm-hmm.
You can do a major in Asian studies or European studies, a full major in English. There are no requirements for language other than English. In the language departments, the language majors, some units are taught in English, some of the cultural units, and those units can sometimes be shared across into other majors such as Asian studies, European studies, or film studies, or elsewhere. But it's important to be clear that European studies and Asian studies are English language programs. The language departments, if you do a major in Spanish and Latin American studies, you'll be learning the language. You also have the option of doing cultural and social units, both in Spanish and in English. Okay, it's perhaps a little complicated for outside, but it's important, I think, to know that European studies and Asian studies are both in English.
And just to chime in on the important comment coming through on the chat as well, that we have lots of opportunities for in-country studies. That is, you can go on exchange for a semester, or we have other short programs that you can undertake to give you that real experience of living in different parts of the world. And although that's been obviously interrupted by the pandemic, we're now resuming full studies. I was just in touch with a student who's been travelling through Eastern Europe, and she's going to be based in France for the rest of this coming semester. So there's lots of exciting possibilities.
Thank you for clarifying that, Peter, because whereas it's true that a major in Spanish and Latin American studies requires the language to be studied, the interesting thing I think we have in the school is that we contribute to each other's programs, and we also contribute to other programs like global studies, where there is a strong focus on area studies as well. And as you said, in film studies unit. So if you have an interest in a regional area, but you don't feel quite confident just now to undertake the task to learn the language, you can always find your way across all the different units, because we work very collaboratively. And as you can see, we have a lot in common, that we really take very in-depth analysis that includes social aspects, economics, culture, and all the kind of things that we do, looking at the history, but also contemporary phenomena across all these wonderful regions of the world.
Thank you so much. I'm just double checking, and while we've got maybe another minute or a little bit over, and we're happy to stay on another minute if there's any more questions. We have posted a few more relevant links in the chat to give you a bit more detail, credit points, and our academics have again shed a bit more light on that information. So if there are no more questions, we may wrap up the webinar fairly shortly. There is currently nothing in the Q&A or the chat, but there are some really, really useful links. So I definitely encourage you all to have a look at the links and to make your way to our course pages for more detail. So like that, there are, course handbook available as well, just like that if you wanted to dig deeper and have a little bit more of a research. And then there's contact details as well if you want to contact us to ask any queries. But let us know. We can hang around for another more minute. Otherwise, we might wrap up fairly shortly. But we thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We hope to see you at the University of Sydney fairly shortly.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. We might leave it there for today. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
Okay. See you.
See ya.